Welcome to the Loved Called Gifted podcast. This is your place to come for musings about spirituality, identity and purpose. I'm your host, Catherine Cowell. So I'm delighted to be joined by Polly again for the last of this little set of episodes about Myers Briggs. So we're looking at different aspects of personality through the lens of the Myers Briggs personality type indicator. And Polly and I are not Myers Briggs practitioners, but we have been sort of living with this stuff and thinking about it for a long time. And we've both found it a really, really helpful lens through which to look at things. So in these sessions, what we've been doing is we've been taking elements of the Myers Briggs and using those to just talk about how we are as individuals and how we interact with one another. So if you were really interested in taking this further, then we would suggest that you either read a really good book about the subject or perhaps go and see a Myers Briggs practitioner who could help you look at what your personality type is. So there we go. So we're on to the last one. So this time we are looking at the difference between judging and perceiving. So if I start by giving a bit of a sort of how I would see the difference between them, and then you can kind of pitch in. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to say, all of these things, we all have a bit of each, but we have a definite preference for one. So we can all behave in ways which fit into either category. And that's the case for all of the Myers Briggs elements. So you can do both, but you will have a definite preference for doing one. So judging and perceiving is about how we like to make decisions and whether we like things to be decided or whether we like to keep them fluid and open and flexible. So if you have a preference for judging, then you are happiest once things are settled and decided and certain. Yes. If you have a preference for perceiving, then you like things to be open and flexible for as long as possible, and you're not that keen on reaching a decision. So happy to reach a decision when it's necessary, but you really value kind of flexibility and openness. And those things have all sorts of ramifications for the way that we do life. And we'll talk about those.
Absolutely, it does. Isn't it? It's like when I've done something, I would really rather have finished it rather than leave it open and wafting when I do something else. And sometimes, again, because we're talking about positives and negatives, the fact that I want to finish something before I think about something else can sometimes be a real issue for somebody. Just think about how you feel when you're interrupted, when you're doing something, and that will probably show which way your preference probably lies.
So I would have in my mind the casserole test.
Oh, sounds exciting. Food is always a brilliant way to illustrate anything in my book.
Well, absolutely. So the casserole test is this. You have got a casserole. Perhaps this casserole is only in the planning, but you know that this evening you are going to eat casserole, and somebody rings you up at fairly short notice and says, "We fancy going out for an Indian tonight. Do you fancy coming with us?" If you have a preference for judging, then it is likely that your first instinct is to think, it's a bit late, we haven't decided this, and I know that this evening I'm going to make casserole. And so you may well say, well, actually, we've already got tea planned, but thank you for the invite. Maybe we could plan something a bit further in advance. If you have a really strong preference for perceiving, then it may be that you've already started making the casserole, you've chopped the onions, and you think, oh, cool, we could go for a curry tonight. It's all right, I'll just stick the onions in a bowl in the fridge. They'll be useful for another occasion.
Well, guess what? I've got half of tomorrow's dinner ready already. Without having to think about it.
Yes, yeah. So that would be a very typical kind of judging, perceiving difference. Another way in which it plays out is the way that people deal with time. So if you have a preference for perceiving, it is more likely that you find it difficult to work out how much time you've got for stuff. So you're more likely to be running a bit late or getting somewhere just in time. Whereas people with a preference for judging, typically, they're unlikely to be rocking up kind of 30 seconds before the thing is meant to start or 10 minutes afterwards. Because you tend to be better at judging sort of where you are in time because you've kind of made those decisions beforehand. That would be a typical.
That's really interesting because I'm kind of thinking, I don't think with me it's that clear cut in terms of the timing of things, because if I'm involved in delivering something, for example, or if I know that somebody specifically wants me there early, I can do that. If I'm delivering, I always like to be there early because I know that if I'm there early, then whoever is organising the event can then relax. So for the benefit of our listeners, I would consider myself, I am a J.
Yeah. When I think about most of the J people that I know are much more sticklers for time. But most of the people I've spoken to with a preference for judging who do turn up late, it's because they have already made a decision about how they use their time. So I remember talking to somebody who definitely has a preference for judging, and she said, well, I have decided that if what I'm doing now is more important than the thing that I'm going to, then I am happy to be late. Whereas when I was managing a speech therapy department in a hospital, we would have meetings, and I routinely would start a job before the beginning of the meeting and then realise that was taking longer than I thought it was going to, and then realised that actually the meeting was a 10-minute walk across the hospital and now I've only got 7 minutes to do it in. And so I would kind of arrive sweating and panting, like screeching in the door just before the meeting started to see my colleagues who'd been sat there very calmly for 10 minutes. I remember spending a morning with a friend who was definitely J. Definitely. And he got a whole list of things we were going to do in this morning. And I could not work out how we were going to do them all because we'd got about 3 hours, and he decided that we were going to go for a walk along the seafront. And then we were going to go and see his cousin. And then we were going to go and see his mate in a different place, and then we were going to pop into this shop to do this thing, and then we were going to go to this place to do that thing, then we were going to grab some lunch, and then we were going to get back to the house because there was an event happening later. And I'm like, that's a lot of things to fit in. But because he had pre-decided what time we were going to leave everywhere, it worked because he'd kind of worked it out in his head. So when we arrived at somebody's house, we were going to be there for 40 minutes. And at 40 minutes, he's standing up and saying, right, well, it's been lovely to see you. Whereas for me, if we were in the middle of an interesting conversation, then I would have shifted my time because actually this that I'm doing now is more interesting. And then I would have crashed the bits that didn't involve letting other people down, like the going to the shop, and that would have got shifted because I'd got involved in a conversation and it had gone on a bit long.
This is really interesting, actually. I've always felt with people, I don't like to put a time limit on it.
Yeah.
I think it's way more important, and if, people want to tell, I would think, my gift to being with people is to be with them for as long as they can cope with. So I kind of think, and probably because I've always worked pretty much full time, so I kind of think the holidays, when I am able to spend time with people, I want them to have as much of me as they want.
Yeah.
So I tend not to think about how much time I'm going to spend with somebody. So it'd be very unusual for me to say to somebody, I need to go now because I'm seeing so-and-so. So I tend to work very, very flexibly when I'm visiting people. So it's really interesting, actually, to me, because I'm like, that obviously is something where I'm almost deliberately working outside my own preference because it's to achieve something that is more important to me.
Yes.
And kind of my own timekeeping.
Yes. So I think where the judging is coming in there is that you have a predetermined determined decision that you've made, which is people are more important, so I don't stick to my times when it's to do with people.
Yeah.
So it's not that life has kind of taken you by surprise, which it does for me. And I think, oh,
yes.
all the time has gone.
I should have been,
Yeah. So it's it's the same kind of impact, but in a different way.
Mm.
Of other examples, one of them I think is to do with how you complete a piece of work, and where you most typically see this, and I think where you have
Jay.
yes so where you would typically see this is in education, when you have a deadline. So you have an essay or a piece of work or a project that needs to be done by a particular time.
It was done before it needed to be, so nothing ever got to that emergency stage because it was all properly planned in. So I guess that probably
That's all very Jay.
Given the free rein then to set things up, then I will set them up to be ready in good time.
And I think you mentioned the wanting to prevent things getting to what you refer to as the emergency stage.
Yes.
And I think that's a really key difference between judging and perceiving, in that if you are talking to somebody with a preference for judging, then they will not really like things to get to an emergency stage. So you want to know that this is done and dusted and sorted, and that there are no surprises coming down the line.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whereas as somebody with a preference for perceiving, I quite like a surprise coming down the line. And one of the things that often happens is that if you've got two people working together and you have a project or something that you're doing, say you're delivering a workshop together, then if you're working with somebody who's got a preference for judging, or who has more of a preference for judging than you do, if you have a preference for perceiving, then whilst you are waiting for the adrenaline to kick in so that you can actually produce your best work, they are drumming their fingers thinking, this is never going to happen. This is feeling like an emergency. So you can cause one another quite a lot of stress.
I would say in group work it's a real issue.
So it's about understanding whether the person that you're working with has a preference for judging or perceiving, and what your preference is, and then how you manage that.
Expectations, isn't it?
Yes. Because as somebody with a preference for perceiving, being expected to come up with what my final answer is before I'm kind of ready to can be quite stressful. So knowing that things are in the diary too far in advance, I find quite stressful.
Okay.
Whereas I know that if you have a preference for judging, then having something in the diary is calming. It's like, okay, I know what's happening. Whereas I kind of think, well, I don't know what else is going to be going on around that. I
think as well that mine has definitely been exacerbated because of having a long-term illness, which basically doesn't leave me with much energy, so I have to really, really budget my energy. So sometimes I know that I've probably missed out on the things that would be fun, but I'm like, if it's not in the diary early enough. But the idea is I have the energy that I have can be measured in spoons. So when it comes to work responsibilities and stuff like that, there's a certain number of spoons that are involved. So I don't have many spoons left at the end of the day, if ever, and I don't often have a lot for the weekend. So if I'm needing to do something at the weekend, or I want to do something at the weekend, I have to be a lot more careful and a lot more vigilant with the spoons in the week leading up to it. So it kind of sits with the judging, because it's like if somebody comes to me on a Friday and says, hey, we're going to go off, we're going to go to the seaside for the weekend, do you want to come? I was like, well, I can't, because
my spoons are budgeted.
Yes, I've got no spoons. If I knew that there was the opportunity of going to the beach, I needed to be saving my spoons. So I think what I would want my judging friends to understand about those of us with a preference for perceiving is that it's quite difficult to be time efficient in advance, if that makes sense. So I think one of the reasons I would tend to do things a bit more last minute is that I know that if I try and do something earlier, there is a good chance that I won't save any time. If I've got 4 hours to do something,
it will take me 4 hours. If I've got 40 minutes to do something, it will take me 40 minutes. Yeah. So it makes sense. People sometimes talk about playing first and working later, or working first and playing later. If you have a preference for judging and you're able to very easily make every decision about the thing that you're doing, and then when you've made your final decision, you've stopped, then that piece of work is finished, then actually you can easily work first and play later, because you know that the work is going to take about the same amount of time. Yeah. Whereas actually, if you find it difficult to kind of settle on something, then what tends to happen is that if I try and start a piece of work early with the intention of getting it finished early, I won't get it finished early.
I will take longer to do it.
I will take longer because there are all sorts of other possibilities that kind of crop up.
Fill the time available instead of focusing.
Instead of focusing, and instead of making those decisions. So I'm better to kind of do the thing that needs doing in the sort of deadline-y slot rather than trying to do it earlier. And the other thing that I've noticed is that my tendency for perceiving is much, much more exaggerated if I'm under stress. So I can adapt quite well these days to working in a judging kind of way, in a more structured, timed way, unless there is real stress or fear around it, in which case my perceiving kind of comes out like...
And I presume you don't want to even think about it until like 5 minutes before you have to.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been doing recently is helping to facilitate some retreats. And the way that we have been running those has been very much about giving people space to be with God.
Yeah.
So not having lots and lots of pre-planned stuff. Yeah. Very aware that although that is a good experience, it's been a good experience for everybody who's come, regardless of personality type. But for those who have a preference for judging, kind of stepping into an undecided, fairly open space.
I presume do they need a bit of a starter activity or something that they can focus on to help them start?
So you're kind of that's interesting. We don't really. So what we do have a little bit of structure in the day, and I'm very careful to tell people about the structure that there is, although all of it is flexible, so you can turn up or not, because I kind of think, well, at least if we're really clear about, we will be meeting at 10:30 if you'd like to come, and we'll have a circle of us, and we'll have opportunity for people to talk about where they're up to and what's happening for them. So to kind of say that is a thing that happened. If you have a preference for perceiving, there is a sense of
goody.
Yes. So that kind of, I can relax into this because it's flexible. Whereas if you have a preference for judging, there's a real, I can relax into this because I know what's going to happen.
It's probably, I'm thinking it's probably a bit like the way I used to approach spring harvest. So other festivals are available. Okay? Yeah. Other weekend conferences around Easter are available. But you would get given a programme, and to me, I'd be like, right, I've come here specifically for this event. Sometimes it would be to hear specific people because they'd been advertised as being there. So I'd be like, right, I want to go to this. And in the first session you go to, they always say, here's the programme, but don't feel that you have to go to everything. Take time out, take space. And I'd be thinking, but I've come here. This is what I've come here for, is to go to all these things. And basically to get my money's worth by going to all these things, because the way that I work it is that I go to all those things. I write notes. As you all know, I'm an absolute manic note taker. And to a certain extent, the things that I would be thinking about, there would be takeaways that I would take straight away. But potentially, again, one of the reasons why I write notes is because I would do my pondering after I've received all of the speaky bits. So I wouldn't necessarily feel that I needed time off between sessions to go and ponder it, because I'm like, no, I'm collecting. Yeah. As we talked before, I'm collecting all the information about this particular topic, and then I will think about it. So again, that's playing into the other it's the other preferences, isn't it, that are kind of, it's sort of working together.
They all work together, but there's a lot of, but you can hear that kind of Jay, and you're much more relaxed talking about, well, there's spring harvest and there's a program.
Yes, yeah.
And even me mentioning, well, there's a retreat and there's lots of free time and you can do what you want. And there's this quizzical kind of, but do people know this is what's going to happen? Do they know what kind of hell you're inviting them to?
I would kind of have an understanding of what a retreat is. So I would understand that.
But no, we do tell people what
yes.
it's about. I think it's really interesting to look at some of the other ways in which that wanting to make a decision kind of feeds into how we lead our lives. And one of them is that people with a preference for judging are much happier with rules and standards than people with a preference for perceiving, because a rule or a standard or a protocol is a pre-made decision. So we have decided that this is how the world works. And so if you can go along with that, then then obviously that will work. And we don't have to make that decision again because we've made it once already.
Which is fine, absolutely fine, while all those decisions are written down on a piece of paper. The minute that they experience people, it tends to go out the window.
Yes, it does. But most people with a preference for judging are quite keen on, well, these are the rules, these are the standards, this is how it works.
What I expected to do, yeah.
Yes.
Judging, sometimes judge has become a bad word, she says. But it's that thing that we think, oh, that means that we're judgmental. And it's like, well, no, actually not. But to a certain extent, we're very good at labelling behaviours as being good or bad when it is a preference. And again, other personality things that I looked at just never sat right with me.
Yeah.
Which is why I really like Myers Briggs, because as soon as I found it, it just seemed to have that flexibility in it. And because it's a preference and it's expressed as a preference, I'm like, actually, that, and thinking about it, that gives me back, when I'm talking about it, when I'm thinking about it, it gives me back the power over the situation.
Yes.
And you know, I really like how it works when you start to move into things like stress, because it's like, I can understand that if I have to keep on compromising my own preference, then eventually that will become really, really, too much stress.
Yes.
For me to stand. And actually, it is important. It's not essential, but it is important to find a balance between places where you are able and situations where you can be in your preference, and balance that with the situations where, for whatever reason, your own decision or somebody else's, etc., where you are working outside your preference. So you can do it, but you need to know that in working outside of your preference, you will probably need to offset that with some leisure activity or something where you are able to work within your preference.
You would have fun planning things.
Well, sometimes it is just sitting down and sitting with pens and pencils and writing things in notebooks. It's like, even if those plans don't actually come to fruition, and to the point even that sometimes I write down what has happened in a diary after it's happened, and you're like, what is the point of that? But it's kind of
gives you some structure.
Yeah.
So
reference points.
Yeah. If you have a preference for judging, then it is very likely that the classic thing of, I will do my Bible reading or my meditating or my whatever in this chair in my house at this time of day every day, and I will have this routine for it. If that works for you, then that's great. But if you have a preference for perceiving, trying to do that is likely to be difficult. And rather than it being life-giving, it is likely to be life draining. So whereas that structure works for somebody with a preference for judging, if you've got preference for perceiving, that isn't going to do it. So one of the things that has been kind of in my mind for quite a number of years about, so how do you manage it? And I think it's about swapping routine for intention. So I will keep up with my fitness routines and my keeping fit and my spiritual disciplines if that is something which is high in terms of intention. So I've been running for the last few months, and that's something which I've done in the past, and that's going quite well. I do not run at the same time every day, But it is in my mind that is something which is a priority. So every 2 or 3 days, I will go for a run. And it might be in the morning, or I might do it later in the day. It's going to fit in somewhere. And the same with my spiritual disciplines, they will fit in somewhere. But I wonder whether what happens with your people with the timetables is that often what happens, if you have a preference for perceiving, is that when you start something, it's exciting and new and interesting. And the creating the timetable is exciting and new and interesting. And then the first couple of times you do it, it's really like, oh, yeah, this is cool. I like this. This is good. I've never done this before. This is good fun. By the time you're on day 3, it's like, oh, yeah, this is all right. I did this yesterday and the day before, but this is all right. By day 4, you're like, yeah. By day 7, oh my life, this is just deadly. And I'm not really thinking about the thing that I'm meant to be doing. What I'm thinking about is, I need to get to the end of this. So you need to plan that in. You need to say, well, I'm going to, rather than creating this timetable, you need to find a way of putting a bit of variety into it. So you could have, for example, for your revision timetable, you could spend your time writing down all of the topics that you are going to do, fold them up into bits of paper, stick them in a jar.
Lucky dip. Yes.
Have a lucky dip. Yeah. But you might do it at different times. So you keep some variety, or you're chilled with the fact that if you started reading a book and you're getting a lot out of it, I think I'm thinking particularly of the sort of the spiritual discipline type things where this is your way of meditating, or this is your way of praying, and you can work through this. Well, it may be that you only get 3 chapters in and then you're like, oh, well then swap. It can be really freeing though, particularly for those of us who are perceivers, to know that
it's okay.
It's okay not to be one of those people who does things regularly. And I think that to always kind of label being regular as self-discipline makes those of us for whom that really doesn't work feel a bit crap, to be honest, because it's like, so I can't do the self-discipline then? Well, I can, again, but I'm going to do it differently.
We used to joke, there's a particular set of Bible notes, isn't there, every day with Jesus, and we used to call it sort of maybe once a month with Uncle Selwyn if the wind's in the right direction, on the basis that it just wasn't always something that you would be able to stick to religiously on a daily basis.
Yeah. So but there are lots and lots of situations where that is sort of seen as
that implication,
the way of doing things. And if that isn't what's going to work for you, then it is about working with yourself and working with what does work. And actually there is just as much self-discipline required to know these are the things that are my priorities. So these are the things that I'm going to give some time to and have a bit of focus around. And I might do that flexibly if I need to, or I might have elements of routine and elements that aren't. But understanding that that's how you work, I think, is really good. I do wonder whether, if you have a preference for perceiving, you're more likely to do some of those re-examining kind of core beliefs and things earlier on, because you're generally more flexible about stuff. But certainly I know that I have come across a number of people who definitely have a preference for judging, who in terms of their beliefs about the world have been much, much slower to shift and be flexible than friends who've had a preference for perceiving. And that thing about, it's interesting that you should talk about the fact that people kind of trumps most things for you. But for people who are more task focused and also have a preference for judging, there can be a tendency to have particular kind of views of the world, and it especially rears its head in terms of
I must
religion.
do this. I must do this, or the world's going to come to an end. Type thing.
And this is what I believe, that God mandates this, and this, and it doesn't matter if you turn up and your life is showing you something different, but you can get that kind of rigidity. And where people have been battered by religious systems, it quite often is because somebody has had a rule. For example, we do not allow divorce. Well, that's fine until somebody's marriage breaks down for some reason. Perhaps you have a partner who's who's been abusive. Perhaps you just were never suited to one another. Perhaps something else has come along and being together is not reasonable anymore. If somebody is very, very J about that and says, no, these are the standards, then people can get battered by it. And then equally, folks would say, well, actually, it's really good to have some level of structure and understanding that gives people some scaffolding. But I suppose my reason for talking about the rule thing is that I think that is one of the things that sometimes happens for people with a preference for judging, that there are kind of particular sort of standards.
I think for me, and obviously, I mean, you will know this, some of the people listening to this will know that I've got a lot of experience with kind of working, and one of the things that I do enjoy doing, it sounds a bit bizarre, but I do enjoy working with people for whom life has not turned out to be good for them in lots and lots of ways. And I think, and coming, with having that J stuff, I think that what has made the difference for me is that there is just something, and I look on it as being, it's just, I think it's kind of the gift. I have to be careful now because I might start crying. But I think this is the gift that God gave me from a very early age, that somehow I didn't equate his love for me in other people's behaviour to me. Whatever they kind of gave allegiance to. Because I was abused when I was a child, I think that that's something that has really helped to transform, if you think, that experience, because I didn't think other people that I've met that similar stuff has happened to, they really struggle sometimes in their relationship with God, because and especially, I've worked with people for whom that abuse came within the church, and you're just like, goodness knows, there is so much about that is just so horrendous to deal with. But I think there's just this thing that knowing that God loved me whatever, and that just seemed for me to transcend a lot of the kind of loops or places where I could have got stuck and become judgmental. It didn't happen, because I was like, but actually, God's love is all about, it's all about meeting that person where they're at. It's not about that person doing, being, getting everything right. And it's kind of like the reading that I've done since has probably given me a better set of language to talk about it. But it's like, that a lot of the heroes, in Hebrews, all of the, those the people who are mentioned as being full of faith, when you look at those people, they were fallible. David, a man after God's heart, when you look at some of the stuff he did, it's like he would have been thrown out. Most of the churches in the US, most of the churches that we know, he'd have been thrown out for most of the stuff that he did. And yet that thread through his life and his relationship with God is, held up to us as being something that, that is the example of, somebody who was always seeking after God. So I think if you can read the Bible, and I guess this was it as well, a lot of the Bible, I was able to read it before somebody else had told me what it meant.
Yeah.
So it's like I could think about it in terms of, well, actually, God is in this situation. God is loving this person. Look what they're doing. Oh, wow, they're doing this. That is really bad. But actually, God hasn't, kicked them in the face. God hasn't walked away from them. So actually, there must be something more to it. But I think it I'd say for me, I would say that for me it's a gift. Yeah. It just happens to be a gift that was given.
One of the other things that had occurred to me in thinking about this is that there is an advantage to not having made decisions that you kind of then struggle to change. So one of the things that I know is that in the work that I do, quite often there's an element of sort of creativity. And sometimes I'll have come up with an idea, but when I've pondered a bit longer, I can see a better way of doing things. So taking a little bit longer to decide and having the flexibility to kind of go back and redo something, I think sometimes means that you end up with a better result. Sometimes you don't, because actually sometimes having something pre-planned works better. So if somebody has a preference for judging and they have really meticulously planned something and found materials, then you might end up with a better quality result. But there is something about not necessarily leaping to the first conclusion. And I see that in picnic spots. There have been experiences in my life where people with a preference for judging have arrived first and not picked the best picnic spot. When we went for an event, and this was drawing people from all over the place, and the people who'd planned this said, oh, this amazing country park, it's a really beautiful place. And indeed it was. And so we'll go there, which meant that it was a huge drive for everybody. So we arrive, and these people who were very much preference for J, they had turned up, they had parked their car in the overflow car park. You know, when you have sort of overflow car parks, which are sort of semi-grassy, but it was a piece of car park. Nobody else was there when they stopped. But they just stopped, got all of the stuff out. So when we arrived...
In the overflow car park.
We had this whole event in the car park, and we're in this huge country park. Like, I would not do that. As somebody with a preference for perceiving, I would turn up and I would faff for quite a bit of time.
Well, presumably, as time went on, did not that overflow car park end up being full of cars?
Not entirely full of cars, but there were quite a lot of cars. But you know what I mean? It was like, we need to make a decision. We've made a decision. This is the decision. This is what we're doing. Whereas as somebody with a preference for perceiving, I will quite often faff quite a bit about, well, where do we fancy going? So I'm not going to pick the first Indian restaurant that I think of, or pick the first picnic spot that I've arrived at. I will spend a bit of time having a bit of a look and working out where I want to be and working out what's the nicest place. And I might faff a bit and sort of sit down under one tree and then see another one somewhere else. And that could be really annoying for somebody who has a preference for judging. So, well, I thought we'd sat down here. I thought this is what we were doing. So, no, I've just not decided yet.
I suppose I think that I'm probably quite amenable.
Yeah.
And I'm nearly often, it's like I will always let somebody else's preference take precedent. But for example, I would probably, if we were arranging something in the future, I would be saying, right, so let's take your example of a picnic, right? We're going to go for a picnic, Trentham Gardens.
Yeah.
I'd be like, okay, that's fine. Whereabouts in Trentham Gardens? Do you want to meet on the car park and then I follow you? Or do you want us to meet at a particular spot at a particular time? Who is going to get there first to get the deck chairs? Or, you know, it's like if you're going to sometimes if there's a bunch of us going to one of the cafes, it's like, right, I'm like, right, somebody needs to get there and bagsy a table and grab all the spare chairs and stuff like that. So I tend not to set where we're going, but I will then, once somebody has decided, I will then try and sort of organise it.
And people with a preference for judging tend to quite like repetition and doing things again. Much more likely to have favourite films that that you're happy to watch more than once, particularly if you also have a set preference for sensing, I think,
Yes.
Yeah, which we've also talked about. But that kind of, I'm happy to repeat stuff. Once we've made a decision, this is what we do. Once we've set some rules, this is what we'll do. I think one of the things that I have learnt over the years is that I can end up expending quite a bit of time deciding things freshly that don't need deciding freshly, and I can save some of my mental energy. So one of the things that I suddenly noticed a few years back is that every time I went into a car park, I was sort of wondering about which would be the best place to park. Well, I could park there or I could park over there. And I thought, this is daft. It doesn't matter. Yeah. This is not a decision that I need to make freshly every time. Having something pre-decided and this is how I do it would probably work quite well.
The first space I find I'm going in, wherever it is. Yeah. It's quite a good approach. It's interesting because I'm, again, thinking about stuff, and with me and Tom, usually the arguments are because I want to get too detailed about something and he's wanting to be general about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but what about something?
So please don't make me. But that's the S and the J, isn't it? It's the kind of the detail versus the big picture and the decided versus the undecided. So you are wanting him to decide details, which is cruel woman.
He doesn't like, I know, aren't I terrible? And he expects me to do something without it being planned. I'm like, how cruel is he? I can truly say that even though it has caused a certain amount of friction, shall we say, over the years, because we are opposite on everything, and sometimes I'm just like, oh my goodness, how long am I going to have to think this through before I can understand how to approach such and such? But actually, I kind of think it would have been really quite boring if I'd been married to somebody that was more like me, because actually I really do think that some of the best, and I kind of knew it by faith when I first discovered Myers Briggs. So we hadn't been married that long when I discovered it, which is good. I used to say to people, God and Myers Briggs saved my marriage.
Yes, you're not the first person to say to me, Myers Briggs saved my marriage.
Especially, I mean, that first year, I just found it so very, very difficult. And Tom was like, that's because everything had changed. It's like you're so... And I missed... even though I was getting married, which is obviously really exciting, I really missed living with the person that I'd lived with, my mate Helen, that I lived with for the first couple of years that I was in Stoke. And I was like, oh, but Helen always talked to me. You don't. Which, again, that's where the kind of the introversion extroversion thing came in, because he didn't have the energy to. But I really think that the best of both of us has come out because of having both of those things. Having the differences. And I think it's made me a lot better at negotiating.
Yes. Yeah.
And some people are happy just through having the opportunity to contribute to a discussion about something.
It strikes me, sort of thinking back to all of the Myers-Briggs, is the degree to which each of these 4 things that we've looked at over these 4 episodes, these 4 sort of dyads. We've looked at introversion and extroversion. We've looked at thinking and feeling, sensing and intuition, and judging and perceiving, which I think would be better named deciding and perceiving, because it really is about deciding things. Judging is a bit
horrible. It's come to mean something different, I think, hasn't it? Judging.
I think it was just used in a slightly different way here. But all of those things run quite deep in the way that we do things. And I've particularly noticed as time's gone by how all of those things influence small things and big things. So my example of faffing about finding a parking space, and I'll faff about what to wear in the morning and what I'm going to eat, whereas my mum will have decided what to wear and what to eat and how to do things. That kind of pre-decided versus undecided thing, it runs through everything. So what your career choice might be, down to whether you spend 30 seconds or 3 seconds deciding which pair of socks to wear, it all kind of feeds in. And so understanding how that works, and understanding how you work, and the fact that how you work is okay, and understanding that other people will do things differently,
and that's also okay.
It's okay. And they are not doing a bad job of being you, and you're not doing a bad job of being them. You are just being yourselves.
And if somebody does something different to you, there's no value implication in that, or there shouldn't be. And if somebody tries to put that kind of value implication on them, it's like, come and see me and I'll go and sort them out for you.
Yes.
And again, that's why I like it being a preference, because I'm like, a preference implies that you have some choice.
You can do all of it.
We can, we do have choices.
And we all do a bit of the other. So I do a bit of judging, and you do a bit of perceiving. And we've also talked about the fact that there are ways in which we don't necessarily fit neatly into these boxes. And the fact that we can grow towards and experiment with and play with using the opposites. And there can be great joy in that too. So
absolutely.
So thank you very much. That's been great. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Loved Called Gifted podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email lovedcalledgifted@gmail.com. You can find a transcript of this podcast at lovedcalledgifted.com. And that's also the place to go if you're interested in the Loved Called Gifted course, or if you'd like to find out about spiritual direction or coaching. Thank you for listening.